98 days. That's how long the stall stood empty before the gate rattled on its own one October morning, and the whole valley learned that some things refused to be sold. I've been ranching these plains for 41 years. I've watched banks take houses, watched droughts take herds, watched good men fold up small at their own kitchen tables. I have never once believed an animal understood the word home, not really, not the way we mean it. Horses are creatures of habit and hunger, I always said. Feed them, water them, and they'll love whoever holds the bucket. Then a copper-colored gelding named Rusty walked out of a corral 100 miles south, crossed 2 rivers, 3 highways, and a stretch of country that kills grown men in summer, and came back to a family that had already grieved him. He came back thinner than a fence post. He came back bleeding at the hooves. He came back to a little girl who had stopped saying his name because saying it hurt too much. And I, a stubborn old skeptic who logs the weather every morning and trusts almost nothing he can't touch, I was standing right there when it happened. This is what I saw. This is what it did to us. And I'm telling you now, before we begin, that the part that shook me wasn't the miles. It was why. The dog started it. That's the honest beginning, though nobody ever tells it that way afterward. It was still dark, that grainy blue-black before the sun commits to anything, and Duke, my old blue heeler, deaf in one ear and mean about mornings, went off like a fire alarm at the north fence. I was 3 sips into my coffee. I set the cup down harder than I meant to, said something my late wife would not have approved of, and went out to see what fool coyote had wandered into range of a dog too old to catch it. I keep a logbook by the door, have for 30 years. Temperature, wind, what the sky's doing, which cows are calving, whether the well pump sounded off. Ellen used to laugh at me for it. You writing a novel, Wade, or running a ranch? Both, I'd tell her. Turns out a man writes his whole life down one dull line at a time. That morning I remember I hadn't written anything yet, and I remember thinking I'd have to come back and log the dog, and I never did, because by the time I came back inside, I didn't have words for the line. I want to get the shape of that morning right, because everything after depends on you understanding how ordinary it started. Frost on the water trough, my breath hanging, the particular squeak of my left boot that I've been meaning to oil for 2 years. Duke throwing himself at the fence wire, and beyond the fence, in the gray, a shape. I thought it was a deer at first, the way it stood. Then I thought it was hurt cattle, one of the Palmer's strays maybe, drifted over in the night. It took me a good 10 seconds, and I'm not proud of how slow I was to understand I was looking at a horse. A horse standing at the wrong fence, on the wrong side of the county, with its head hung so low its nose nearly brushed the ground. Now here's the thing you need to know about me and horses. I don't sentimentalize them. I've buried too many. I've had one break my hip and another break my heart, and somewhere along the line I decided the smart play was to keep a little distance, feed them well, and not ask them to be anything they weren't. So when I climbed through that fence, and my knees are shot, so climbing through a fence is a whole event, I wasn't thinking about miracles. I was thinking, whose animal is this, and how much trouble is it going to be? Then it lifted its head and looked at me, and I stopped where I stood. I'd seen this horse before. Not often. Twice, 3 times maybe, over at the Cutter place, back before the Cutters lost the lease. A red gelding, copper going to rust in the flanks, with a white sock on the off hind and a way of pinning his ears when he didn't trust you. The Palmer's oldest girl used to ride him at the county fair. I remembered because she'd won something on him, a ribbon, and her daddy had stood by the rail with his hat in both hands looking like a man who'd been handed proof of God. But the Palmers had sold him. Everybody knew that. Everybody knew a lot about the Palmers that spring, the way a small county always knows the private disasters of its people and pretends not to. Del Palmer had run cattle on land his grandfather broke, and 2 years of drought and one bad loan had run him right off it. They'd sold the herd. They'd sold the machinery. And near the end, when there was nothing left with a price on it but the things that hurt to sell, they'd sold the horse. To a man down near Caldwell, 100 miles south, give or take. I stood in that frostbitten pasture doing arithmetic I didn't want to do. "You can't be him," I said out loud like an idiot to a horse. He took a step toward me and nearly went down. I've seen animals in bad shape. I've seen starvation and neglect and the slow ruin of hard winters. This was different, and it took my brain a minute to sort out why. He wasn't neglected. You could see under the wreck of him that he'd been a well-kept animal, good feet once, good weight once. This was use. This was a body spent all the way down to the studs. His hooves were split and worn to the quick, cracked up the walls, one of them wrapped in dried blood and dust into something I didn't like to look at. His ribs stood out like the slats of an old barn. There were cuts along his chest and forelegs, barbed wire. I'd learn later, a lot of barbed wire, and burrs matted so deep into his mane they'd become part of him. His eyes had that sunken, faraway cast that scared me most of all, because I've seen it in horses that are already halfway gone and just haven't gotten the news. But he was standing. God knows how, but he was standing, and he was pointed north. And when I moved to his left side, he turned his ruined head to keep me in view and let out a breath that rattled all the way up from someplace deep. I did the only thing I know how to do. I went and got a bucket of water, and I did not rush him, and I talked low nonsense the whole time, the way you do, and I let him decide. He drank like he'd forgotten how, half of it down his chin. And while he drank, I stood there with one hand not quite touching his neck, feeling the heat still coming off a body that had been working itself past any reasonable limit. And I did a thing I hadn't done in the 4 years since Ellen died. I got choked up over a horse. I'm 63 years old. I'd like to tell you I stayed composed. I didn't. Something about the way he leaned, just barely, just an ounce of his ruined weight, into that hand I wasn't quite touching him with, like he'd decided I was safe, like he'd been holding himself upright on willpower alone for so long that the first offer of shelter cracked something loose in him. I've thought about that lean more times than I can count. I think about it still. Then he did the thing that told me everything. He finished drinking and he turned away from me. Not spooked, not mean. He just turned north again toward the far fence, toward the road, and he took a step, and another. He was leaving. He'd stopped for water the way a man stops for gas, and now he meant to go, and he was going in a straight line that had nothing to do with me and my bucket and my safe hand. North, always north. I looked where he was looking. Past my north fence, past the county road, the land rolled up toward the Palmer place, or what used to be the Palmer place, 6 miles on. And I understood, standing there in the cold with a bucket in my hand, that this animal was not lost. Lost animals wander. Lost animals drift with the wind and the grass. This one had a bearing. This one had a destination, and it had been walking toward it. I would find out. For the better part of 2 weeks. And it was not going to stop 6 miles short just because a kind old man had offered it a drink. "Hey now," I said, and my voice came out wrong. "Hey, not like that, you'll die like that." Because that was the truth of it. He would not make 6 more miles in that condition. He'd been running on something past his body for days, and the water had bought him maybe an hour, and if I let him walk out my north gate, he was going to lie down in a ditch somewhere and not get up, and some part of him would still be pointed home. So I made a choice. I want to be honest that it wasn't a noble one, not at first. My first instinct was practical and cold. Catch him, pen him, sort out whose problem he was later. I got a lead rope. I got him haltered, he let me, too tired to argue, and that ease was its own kind of gut punch. And I got him into my near paddock with the good grass and the run-in shed. And I latched the gate. And he stood there against the far rail with his nose pointed north through the boards like a compass that couldn't understand why it had stopped moving. And then I went inside to make a phone call I'd been dreading since the arithmetic first added up, because I knew what I was going to have to do, and I knew what it was going to do to somebody. I had to call the Palmers and tell them their horse was in my paddock. I had to call a family that had already lost everything, that had already done the hardest math a ranch family ever does, and sold off a piece of their own hearts to keep the lights on. And I had to say, the thing you gave up came back. I sat at my kitchen table with the phone in my hand for a long time. Duke came and put his gray muzzle on my knee. Outside the window I could see the gelding, Rusty. That was his name. It came to me sitting there. The girl used to holler it across the fairgrounds, standing motionless at the north rail with the sun finally coming up gold behind him, lighting up every terrible detail of what the road had done to him. Here's what I kept snagging on, what made me set the phone down twice before I dialed. It wasn't the miracle of the miles, though the miles were a miracle, and I'd spend weeks after trying to trace the route he must have taken, the rivers he must have swum, the highways he must have somehow crossed without dying. No, what snagged me was this. Somebody had bought that horse, paid good money. That horse belonged, legally and plainly, to a man in Caldwell who'd done nothing wrong except purchase an animal from a family that needed to sell it. And 100 miles of walking doesn't change a bill of sale. Rusty hadn't come home. He'd come to a home that no longer existed, that had been sold out from under all of them. And the family he was walking toward couldn't even keep themselves, let alone a horse they'd already grieved and let go of once at terrible cost. I dialed Del Palmer's number. I still had it in the church directory. And while it rang, I looked out at that copper-colored ruin of an animal standing in my paddock, and I understood that I hadn't rescued anybody. I just handed a broken family, the one choice worse than the one they'd already survived. A woman answered, young, not Del, a girl's voice, careful and tired in a way no young voice should be. Palmer residence. This is Wade Holly's, I said. Out on the Cross H North End. Is Del around? A pause. Daddy's out looking for work. This is June. Another pause, and then, because a small county is a small county and my name meant something to her, is everything okay, Mr. Holly's? June, the girl with the ribbon. The girl who used to holler Rusty across the fairgrounds. I looked out the window. The horse looked north. And I opened my mouth to tell her. And for the life of me, I could not find the shape of it, because there was no way to say he came back that wasn't also going to say, and now you have to lose him twice. June, I finally managed. Honey, I need you to sit down, and I need you to not get your hopes. I stopped. That was a lie before I'd finished it. Her hopes were already up. Mine were too, God help us both. I've got something in my paddock, I said, and I think you'd better come see it before your daddy gets home. I heard the phone shift. I heard her breathing change. And very quietly, in a voice that had already guessed, that had maybe been half praying for this exact impossible thing without ever letting herself say it out loud, June Palmer said one word. Rusty. I closed my eyes. Outside, the sun cleared the ridge, and the whole ruined length of him lit up like a struck match, and he took one step toward the north rail and stopped and waited for her, I think now, though I didn't know it yet, the way he'd been waiting and waiting for 240 miserable, impossible hours. You'd better come quick, I said. And June, bring your daddy's trailer. And here my old skeptic's heart broke clean in two because I could already see the whole cruel shape of what was coming. We're going to have to talk about some things when you get here. Hard things. Things I don't have the answer to. I hung up before she could ask what things. I didn't have the heart to be the one to tell her that her horse had walked 100 miles to come home to a home that belonged to strangers now, and that somewhere down in Caldwell, a man with a bill of sale and a legal right was, at that very moment, probably wondering where his gelding had got to. She got there in 19 minutes. I know because I logged it, force of habit, and because 19 minutes to cover the 6 miles from the Palmer place means that girl drove her daddy's truck like the devil was checking his watch. I heard the trailer rattling up my road before I saw it. Then the truck slewed into my yard in a boil of dust, and June Palmer came out of the driver's door before it had fully stopped rolling, 17 years old, all elbows and desperation, her hair half out of its braid, and she didn't say hello, didn't say a word to me at all. She just ran for the paddock. And I want to tell you what happened when the horse saw her, because I've turned it over in my mind 1,000 times and I still can't explain it, and I've stopped trying. Rusty had spent the whole hour I'd penned him standing at the north rail like a nail driven into a board. Nothing I did moved him. But when June's boots hit the gravel, before she said anything, before she even reached the fence, that ruined animal's head came up, and his ears, which had hung slack and hopeless since dawn, swiveled forward hard, and he made a sound I have never heard a horse make before or since. Not a whinny. Lower than that. A kind of broken open groan that came up out of his chest, and he came off that rail and half staggered, half fell across the paddock toward her, and got his split-open feet tangled and went down to his knees in the dirt, and got back up because he had to, and pressed the whole ruined length of his face against the fence boards where she was. June didn't cry pretty. I'll say that for her. She made an ugly, tearing sound and got both arms through the fence and around his neck and put her face in his filthy, burr-matted mane, and she said his name over and over, and he stood there and let her, shaking, leaning into it, breathing her in like water. I turned around and looked at my own boots for a while. Some things you don't have any business watching. When I looked back, she'd let herself into the paddock and had her hands moving over him, down his neck, his shoulders, finding every cut, every split hoof, her breath hitching worse with each one. She was 17 and she'd grown up on a ranch, and she knew exactly what she was reading in his body. She knew what it cost him. I watched her face do the math, and I watched the joy in it fold down into something older and worse. "How," she said, not to me, to him. "How did you, Rusty, how?" I came up slow and stood outside the rail. "I figure he's been on the road 10, 12 days, I said. "Maybe more, judging by his feet and his weight." I paused. "He came in this morning at the north fence. Wouldn't stop walking. He was heading for your place, June, straight line, wasn't lost." She looked up at me, and her face was wet and streaked with his dirt now too, and she said, "We didn't want to sell him." Like a confession, like I was owed one. "Mr. Hollies, we didn't." Daddy cried. I've never seen my daddy cry, not when we lost the cattle, not when the bank, but the day the man came for Rusty. Daddy went out to the barn and he didn't come back for an hour, and when he did his eyes were— She stopped, wiped her face with the back of her wrist, smeared the dirt worse. "We didn't have a choice. You understand, we had to eat. We had to, there was nothing left to sell. He was the last thing." "I know it," I said, and I did. "I'm not judging a soul, there's no shame in it. Half this county sold something it loved to keep the rest." But she'd heard the thing I hadn't said yet. She was a smart girl, and she'd already run ahead to the part I was dreading. "He's not ours anymore," she said it flat, testing it. "Is he, legally? He belongs to that man in Caldwell, Mr. Renner, that's who bought him." There it was, out in the open where I couldn't soften it. "Legally," I said, and hated the word in my mouth. "Yes, that's about the size of it." And that was the moment right there, standing in my paddock with her arms around a horse that had crossed 100 miles of hell to reach her, that June Palmer had to become the grown-up her family couldn't afford to be that morning. Her daddy was out somewhere begging for work. Her mama, I'd learned, was working doubles at the hospital in town. And here was this 17-year-old girl having to hold, all by herself, the two facts that could not both be true. He came back to me and he isn't mine. I watched her hold them. I watched it nearly break her. And then I watched her do something that made me revise. Permanently and downward, my whole opinion of my own character. She stepped back from the horse. Just half a step, but deliberate. She put a hand flat on his neck to steady herself, or him, or both, and she said, in a voice she was holding together with both hands, "Then we have to call him, Mr. Renner. We have to tell him where his horse is." I stared at her. "June." "It's his," she said, and the tears were just running now unremarked while her voice stayed level. "If somebody stole from us, if somebody had our cattle and knew it, we'd want the call. We'd want it, Mr. Hollies. Daddy raised me that you don't keep what isn't yours just because keeping it feels good." She laughed, a wet, awful little sound. "God, I hate that he raised me that way. Right this second I hate it so much. I have been to church most Sundays of my life, and I have rarely seen anything I'd call holy. I saw one that morning. A ruined girl choosing to do the right and unbearable thing when every part of her was screaming to load that horse in the trailer and run. But here's where it gets complicated. Here's where I stop being a bystander and start being a man who has to decide something. Because I looked at that horse, at what he'd done, at the impossible, unkillable want that had driven a domestic animal across 100 miles of country that eats horses for breakfast. And I looked at that girl choosing to give him up clean, and something in me that had been cold and careful and safe for 4 years since I put Ellen in the ground just refused. "Hold on," I said. "Before you make that call, just hold on a minute." Because I'd had an hour to think, sitting at my kitchen table, and I'd thought of something. "That man paid for a horse," I said slowly, working it out as I said it. "A sound horse. A ribbon horse, good feet, good weight. That's what he paid for, that's what he took home." I nodded at Rusty, at the wreckage of him, the split hooves, the wire cuts, the ribs. "That's not what's standing here. What's standing here is an animal that just told the whole world in the only language it's got that it will destroy itself to get away from that man's place and back to yours. It jumped a fence, or crawled a fence, look at those chest cuts, that's wire, June, he went through wire, and it walked till its feet came apart. Twice, near as I can tell, because these outer cracks are older than these." June went very still. "A man like Renner," I went on, and I was making it up as I went, but it was landing true. "He's a stockman, paid cash money. He's going to look at what comes off that trailer, and he's going to know two things. One, he's got a horse that will hurt itself bad, maybe kill itself, every single time it gets a chance trying to leave. And two, I let it sit. Two, he's got a horse worth about a third of what he paid for it now. Wire-scarred, foundered feet likely after all this. Might never be right again." "You're saying—" "I'm saying," I said, "that you make the call. You do it your way, the honest way, and I'll stand right here while you do it. But you tell that man the whole truth. You tell him what the horse did. And then my old careful heart went out over open air with no ground under it. And then you tell him you'd like to buy him back. And you offer him a fair price for what's actually standing in this paddock. Which is a broke-down, wire-cut, footsore gelding that's no good to anybody on God's earth, except one girl 6 miles up the road." She stared at me. "We don't have any money," she whispered. "Mr. Hollies, that's the whole, we don't have anything. That's why we sold him. We can't buy anything." "No," I said, "you can't." And I let that sit too, until she understood what I wasn't saying, until her eyes went wide and then filled, and then she started shaking her head. "No, no, we couldn't. We could never." And I talked right over the top of it in the flat rancher's voice I use for cattle prices and dead friends, so she'd know it wasn't up for negotiation. "I've got more money than I've got years left to spend it, and no soul on this earth to leave it to," I said. "Ellen and I never—" Something caught. I pushed through it. "You'll make the call, and you'll tell him the truth. And if he names a fair price for a ruined horse, then the ruined horse is going home with you today, and you and I will never speak of who paid for it again. That's the deal. That's the only deal I'm offering, and you don't get to say no to it. Because I'm an old man and I'm entitled to do one damn fool sentimental thing before I die, and this is it." June Palmer put both hands over her mouth. Behind her, Rusty, who'd been leaning his ruined weight against the rail this whole time, listening to us decide his life the way animals do, patient, spent, home enough just to be near her, let out a long breath and finally, let his head drop. Not the hopeless droop of the dawn. The other kind. The kind where a body that's been holding itself up on pure will for 2 weeks finally believes it's allowed to stop. He'd stopped pointing north. "Get your phone," I told her, and my own voice wasn't too steady. "Let's find out what kind of man we're dealing with down in Caldwell. And June," she looked at me, "however it goes, you did the right thing first. Before I opened my mouth. You were going to give him back. I want you to remember, whatever happens next, that you were going to do the hard right thing all on your own." She nodded. She took out her phone with a hand that shook. She found the number, she'd kept it, of course she had, the number of the man who'd taken her horse. She'd probably looked at it 100 times. And she dialed a stranger 100 miles south to tell him the truth and beg him for a mercy he had no reason on earth to grant. I've thought a lot about the fact that everything turned on a man I never met. Frank Renner of Caldwell. I'll never lay eyes on him. But I stood 4 feet away while June talked to him, close enough to hear the tinny shape of his voice come out of that phone, and I made up my mind about him the way you make up your mind about a man from how he handles one hard minute. She told him all of it, her voice cracking, then steadying, then cracking again. She told him the horse was at my place, gave him my name and location before he even asked, so he'd know she wasn't hiding anything. She told him how Rusty had come in. She told him about the wire and the feet and the weight. She did not once say please in that first stretch, and I understood she was refusing to beg until she delivered every piece of the truth that might cost her, because she wasn't going to buy mercy with a lie. And then there was a long quiet on the line. I could hear him breathing, an older man's breath heavy. I braced for it. I'd braced all morning for the version of this where Renner said, "That's my horse. I'll send my trailer, thank you kindly," which was his right, plain and simple, and I'd already half decided I'd offer him double, triple, whatever it took, and I'd hate every dollar of it, but I'd pay. Instead, the tinny voice said something that made June's whole face change. "He asked," she said to me, hand over the phone, dazed, "if Rusty made it across the Sabine, the river. He asked did the horse cross the river." I didn't understand. Then slowly I did. Renner had been looking for him. Of course he had. A man loses a horse, he goes looking. And a stockman who'd spent 12 days searching 100 miles of country for an animal, that man had been standing at that same river, I'd bet, looking at that brown water, thinking no horse crosses that, thinking his gelding was drowned or gone for good. And here was a girl on the phone telling him the horse had not only crossed it, but had walked another 60 miles past it, half dead, aiming itself at a home that wasn't even a home anymore. June listened for a while. She started nodding, then couldn't stop nodding, tears sheeting down, and she kept saying, "Yes, sir," and "Yes, sir," and "I understand, yes, sir." And I stood there with my old heart going like a colt's, unable to read the verdict off half a conversation. Then she lowered the phone against her chest and looked at me, and I will carry the look on her face to my grave. "He said," she managed. "He said a horse that'll do that," she gestured at Rusty, "at all of it, isn't his horse. He said it never was. He said you can't own the part of an animal that walks 100 miles home. He said," she broke, put herself back together, "he said keep him, just keep him. No money. He said, little girl, I paid for a horse, but that's not what he is, and I'd be a fool and worse to try and keep something that already told me twice it'd die before it stayed." I had to turn around again and look at the ridge for a while. "He said one more thing," June said behind me, and her voice was strange. "He said, will you tell my daddy something? He said tell Del Palmer that no man should have to sell the thing his kid loves to keep his family fed, and that he's sorry he was the one who bought it, and that this," a long shaking breath, "this makes it right. Somehow. That's what he said. That this makes it right." And that's the story. That's the whole impossible thing, and I've told it as straight as I know how, without dressing it up, because it doesn't need dressing up, and because Ellen always said the truth stands better naked. But I'll tell you the part that the story leaves out when folks repeat it now, because they do repeat it. It got out somehow, small counties, and then it got big, and there were people from the television and a fellow who wrote it up for a magazine and made it sound like something off a calendar. The horse who walked home. They all wanted the miracle, the miles, the river, the unkillable want. Nobody ever asked about after. Here's after. We loaded him in the trailer, and he loaded easy, he loaded glad, and that near broke me all over again, this horse who'd fought wire and rivers and 100 miles of country walking calmly up a ramp because June was on the other end of the lead. I followed them home. I wanted to see it. I'd earned that much, I figured. Del Palmer got back to that rented place at dusk, tired and empty-handed from a day of asking men for work they didn't have to give, and he came around the side of the house and stopped dead, because there was a trailer in his yard, and his daughter was standing at the door of it. And when she opened it and backed a copper-colored ruin of a horse down the ramp, Del Palmer, a grown man, a hard man, a man who'd sold off his whole life one piece at a time without a public tear, Del Palmer went down. Just folded, right there in the dirt of a yard that wasn't even his, onto his knees with both hands over his face. And the horse walked to him, past the good grass, past the water, straight to the broken man in the dirt, and put its ruined head down against Del Palmer's shoulder and stood there. And Del got one arm up around its neck, and I heard him say something into its mane that I wasn't meant to hear, so I won't repeat it, except that it had the word sorry in it more than once. I drove home in the dark. I didn't log the weather that night. First time in 30 years I skipped it. Some days don't reduce to a line. They kept him, in case you're wondering. It wasn't easy, his feet were a project, and there were vet bills, and the Palmers had exactly no room for vet bills. But this county's a small one, and word gets around, and it turned out a lot of people had a little to give toward a horse that had done a thing none of us could stop thinking about. I gave what I gave, and I'll not say what, and neither will June. That was our deal, and she's kept it. Del found work that spring. Not ranching. He drives for the feed co-op now, which for a man like Del is its own quiet grief. But it's honest and it's steady, and June's got 2 more years at home before she goes off to be whatever she's going to be. Rusty grazes a rented 5 acres and follows her along the fence line every evening like a dog, and his feet grew back mostly right, and he'll never be a ribbon horse again, and nobody cares. I go by sometimes. I'm not much for visiting, never was, but I go by. And here's the thing I still can't square, the thing that keeps this from being a tidy story with a bow on it. I asked June once, when it was just us at the fence, what she thought made him do it. 100 miles, through all of that. I asked her because I'm an old skeptic and I still don't have an answer, and I thought maybe a girl who loved him might. She was quiet a long time. Rusty came and put his head over her shoulder, that copper head with the gray coming into it now around the eyes. I don't think he was walking to anything, she finally said. I think everybody's got that part wrong. I don't think he even knew we didn't live at the old place anymore, or that it got sold, or any of it. I don't think horses know that. Then what? I said. She scratched the underside of his jaw the way he likes. I think, she said slowly, he just couldn't stay where I wasn't, that's all. I don't think it was about home at all. I think it was only ever about. And then she stopped, and she didn't finish it. And I've decided I'm glad she didn't, because some part of me suspects that if she'd said the last of it out loud, plain, it would have shrunk down into something a person could put on a calendar. So I'll leave it where she left it. At a fence at dusk, with a ruined horse's head on a girl's shoulder, and the rest of the sentence hanging in the air between us, unfinished, the way the truest things usually are. I still keep my logbook, but I've started leaving a little room at the bottom of some pages now, for the things that don't fit on the line.